Before you scroll past this one, understand what happened in that studio has never happened before, and the people who run the show said it will never happen again. 43 years of television, more than 10,000 episodes, and the one moment the producers say they will carry to their graves happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. In the middle of a round, nobody was winning, when a 74-year-old man named Raymond reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the podium that stopped an entire production in its tracks. Nobody moved. Not the floor director, not the audience, not Steve Harvey, who had been mid-pivot toward the board and froze with one hand still raised, his body caught in the exact posture of a man whose brain had just received information his instincts had not caught up to yet. The overhead lighting hummed. The board, still half lit with the previous answer, gave off a low electronic glow, and Raymond, 74 years old, brown suit, the kind of man who pressed his own shirts and had done so every week for 50 years, stood at the podium and looked at the object he had placed there and then looked up at Steve. On his face was the kind of still that comes not from having nothing inside it but from having far too much. "I brought something," Raymond said. "I need to tell you about it, if that's all right." It was a photograph, black and white, slightly creased along one corner, the kind printed on the thick paper they used in the 1960s and 1970s, before digital made everything thin and disposable. In it, a young woman stood in front of a house with her arms at her sides, looking directly into the camera with an expression that was not quite smiling, but was not smiling either. The expression of someone who was comfortable being looked at, who had nothing to hide and no reason to perform. She looked like a person who had decided sometime before the photo was taken exactly who she was. "That's my wife," Raymond said. "That's Elaine." The studio fell completely silent. Her name was Elaine Louise Beaumont, before she became Elaine Beaumont Porter, and she had grown up in a town called Yazoo City, Mississippi, the youngest of 6 children in a house with one bathroom and a piano that nobody had tuned since 1958, but that everyone played anyway. She had been the kind of person who, when she walked into a room, did not change the energy of it so much as reveal what the energy had always wanted to be. She had a gift for making people feel that the thing they had just said was the most interesting version of what they could have said. She remembered the names of people she had met once, years ago, and asked after their children by name, and meant it. She had worked as a school librarian in Columbus, Georgia, for 31 years and had read aloud to children at story hour every Thursday morning until 2 months before she died, even when she had to sit down to do it. She had died on March 14th, 2023, of a recurrence of the ovarian cancer that had first appeared in 2019. That had retreated, under treatment, and then come back the following spring with a decisiveness that her oncologist described, in the careful language of medical professionals, as aggressive. The second diagnosis had come on a Tuesday. Elaine had listened to the doctor and asked 3 specific questions, and then asked if they could stop at the good barbecue place on the way home, because she had been thinking about their pulled pork. For a week, Raymond had driven to the barbecue place, and they had sat in a booth and eaten and talked about their son David's new apartment and whether the paint color he'd chosen for the living room was going to look different once the furniture was in, and Raymond had eaten and laughed and responded, and also spent the entire meal in a kind of terror, so total and so silent that it had no edges, no bottom, no surface it could find to push off from. It had never told her how afraid he was. Not once in the 4 years that followed. Not during the first treatment cycle. Not during the 2 years of remission. Not during the second diagnosis. Not during the 14 months after that when the treatments were harder and the good days grew shorter and Elaine began sleeping more and eating less and losing, degree by degree, the physical volume that a body takes up in a room. He had told her she was doing well. He had told her on a Wednesday in January, when she was too tired to sit up, and had asked him whether he was going to be all right, that he was going to be fine, and that she should not worry about him, and that he needed her to rest. He had said this in a voice that he had practiced, silently in the car on the drive to the hospital that morning, making sure it was steady before he used it. What had not said was the true thing, which was that he did not know how to exist in a world that did not have her in it. He had been 22 years old when he met her at a church social in Columbus in 1971, and he had known within 40 minutes a specific number he had told the story with for 50 years. that she was the person he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. A had proposed 6 months later in her mother's kitchen, on one knee on a linoleum floor with a ring he had spent 4 months saving for. And she had said yes before he finished the sentence. And her mother had cried in the doorway, and the memory of it was so specific, so bodily vivid, that Raymond could put himself back in that kitchen in an instant, could feel the linoleum under his knee and smell the greens on the stove and hear the particular sound of Elaine saying yes. He could not figure out where to put that memory now. That was the thing nobody had told him about grief. He had expected the sadness. He had expected the loneliness of a house designed for two that now only had one. He had not expected the persistence of the physical world, the coffee mug still in the cabinet every morning. A fact rather than a comfort. He had not expected that the smell of her would be in the bedroom for 6 weeks, and then one morning would be gone, and that the morning it was gone would be the hardest so far. He had not expected that what ambushed him most was a sound. The sound of a door opening, which for 52 years had meant she was coming home, and which now was just a door. Their daughter-in-law, Kessia, had submitted the family to family feud. This was Kessia's nature. She responded to difficult things by finding something to do, and the difficult thing was Raymond, who had been doing what worried David most. He had been fine. He answered the phone. He went to church. It told his cardiologist in August that he was sleeping reasonably well, the kind of answer that sounds complete until you notice the word reasonably. He ate dinner. He pressed his shirts. He had been fine the way a leve is fine, holding, but at a cost that doesn't show until it doesn't. Kessia had also invited Raymond's sister Lorraine, and David and her own sister Tomeka, who was loud and competitive and had given the team its best chance of actually winning something. They arrived on the set on October 3rd, 2023, and Raymond in his brown suit had looked at the cameras and the lights and the audience and had said to David, quietly, that Elaine would have loved this. David had pressed his mouth together and nodded, and they had not talked about it again before the taping started. They were in the second round. The category was, name something you'd take with you if you only had 1 minute to grab what mattered most. Tomeka had buzzed in and said my phone and gotten the number 3 answer, which was a solid start. Then the opposing family, the Chukus from Houston, a 4th-generation Nigerian-American family with a grandmother named Ngozi who was 91 years old and had been brought to the taping in a wheelchair and who had already made the audience love. By answering, my good wig, to an earlier question, had taken the board. They were good. They were comfortable and fast, and clearly had practiced. Nosy, when it was her turn, leaned forward in her chair and said, my Bible, with the absolute authority of someone who had never doubted that answer for one moment of her life. And the board lit up with the number 1 answer, and the audience applauded in the specific way they applaud when something is both correct and obviously true. The Chuku family struck out on their 4th answer, and the board came back to the porters, and it was Raymond's turn, and he stepped to the podium, and instead of reaching for the buzzer, he reached into his inside jacket pocket and placed a photograph on the wood surface in front of him. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey walked toward him the way you walk towards something you don't want to disturb. He looked at the photograph on the podium. Then he looked at Raymond. Sir, he said, tell me about her. And Raymond told him. He spoke for 7 minutes and 14 seconds, which the production team would later confirm was the longest, uninterrupted personal statement in the show's broadcast history across all formats and international versions. He spoke without notes, without preparation, in the conventional sense, though David would say later that he suspected his father had been composing this particular account for months in the way that certain people compose things, not on paper, but in the quiet of a house at night, finding the right words and then the right order for the right words, without knowing where they would be spoken. It told Steve about the church social in 1971. It told him about the linoleum floor. It told him about Jazzo City and the untuned piano, and the way Elaine made people feel that their words were the most interesting version of what they could have said. It told him about 31 years of story hour on Thursday mornings and the children who were now adults who had written to him after she died. This stack of letters on his kitchen table that he had read once and then put away because the second reading would be more than he could manage alone. Somewhere in the 3rd minute, the studio fell completely silent, in a way that was different from the earlier silences. Not the silence of surprise, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a room full of people listening as hard as they could. The way you listen when someone is saying something that you recognize as true, even though you have never heard it said before. 3 camera operators were crying. 2 of the production coordinators in the booth, watching on monitor, had stopped making notes. The member of the Chuku family, standing nearest the podium, Ngosi's granddaughter, a young woman named Adayes, had both hands pressed flat against her chest. Raymond got to the end. He looked at the photograph for a moment, and then he looked at Steve. "I brought her," he said, "because I didn't know how to come without her." The room made no sound. Steve Harvey stood in front of this man for a long time without speaking. His jaw worked. He looked at the floor and then at the ceiling and then at Raymond, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had heard a great deal in his life and was being reminded that he had not heard everything. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home," he said, and his voice was down a register from where it usually lived, the way a voice goes when it has stopped performing and started meaning. "You are going to love somebody, or you already do. And one day, not today, God willing, not today, there is going to be a morning when you reach for them and they are not there. And you are going to have to find a way to carry everything they were." He stopped. This man carried her here, in a coat pocket. Another stop. That is what love looks like when it finishes. That is the whole thing. Nobody in that audience made a sound for 11 seconds. The floor director counted them. But Steve wasn't done. A asked Raymond, carefully, if he could hold the photograph for a moment. Raymond nodded. Steve held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time, and then said to the audience, "Look at her. Look at her face." She knew exactly who she was. He held it up toward the camera. "This is Elaine. Everybody say her name." And 307 people said the name of a woman they had never met. In a television studio in Los Angeles, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the sound of it was the strangest and most human thing the production crew said they had ever heard in that building. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the Chuku family. He said that the producers had consulted during the last several minutes, and that they were going to do something the show had not done since its first season in 1976. They were ending the round early, and both families were receiving the prize, because this was not a moment the show was willing to put a score on. Nosy, 91 years old in her wheelchair, had been watching Raymond the entire time he was speaking. When Steve made the announcement, she wheeled herself forward. Her grandson tried to help and she waved him off with a single decisive motion. And she came to the podium and she took Raymond's hand in both of hers and she said, "I have been a widow for 19 years. It does not get smaller, but you get larger. You hear me?" Raymond looked at this 91-year-old woman, and something passed over his face that Getsia would describe later to her own mother on the phone that night. As the first time she had seen him look something other than held together. He nodded. He said, "Yes, ma'am." And Noxie held his hand and did not let go for a long time. The clip was posted on October 5th, 2023. In the first 24 hours, it received 14.8 million views. In the first week, 49 million. But the number that the production team talked about most was not the views. It was the average watch time, which was 6 minutes and 48 seconds, which is nearly unheard of for a viral clip on short-form platforms, where the average is under 90 seconds. People were staying for the whole thing. They were watching Raymond speak for all 7 minutes. They were staying for Nosy. The clip was shared in grief support forums, in hospice care worker networks, in widow and widower communities with combined memberships of more than 4 million people. A palliative care physician named Dr. Sandra Osei posted a thread on social media saying that the clip had said, in 7 minutes, something she spent years trying to say to families in clinical language. That grief is not the end of love. That it is love with nowhere to go. That the person carrying it needs to be given room to say the name. 3 months later, Raymond was the keynote speaker at a grief literacy conference in Atlanta, attended by 800 social workers, hospice nurses, counselors, and clergy. He brought the photograph. He put it on the lectern. He spoke for 30 minutes, 1 minute for each year Elaine had read to children on Thursday mornings. At the end, the conference organizer asked the room to say her name. 800 people said it. Raymond had to grip the lectern with both hands, but he stayed standing. A year after the taping, a foundation called Carry Her Here, the name taken from Raymond's 7 words. Ad-funded grief literacy training programs in 62 community organizations across 19 states, focusing specifically on isolated elderly widows and widowers who had no formal support pathway. The population that research showed was most at risk of what clinicians called grief-related health decline, and what Raymond, in his keynote, had called disappearing without anyone noticing. The foundation had trained more than 300 volunteer grief companions. David ran the board of directors. Kesia was the program director. Lorraine ran the peer support line every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon from her kitchen table in Columbus. Today, Raymond still presses his shirts. He still goes to church every Sunday. He still has the coffee mug in the cabinet. And he still sees it every morning. And it is still a fact. But he has started, since the Thursday of the taping, doing something that he did not do before. On Thursday mornings, the same mornings Elaine used to read to children, he goes to the public library 3 miles from his house, and he reads aloud to whoever is there. It started with the Library Story Hour program, which needed volunteers. The first morning he did it, there were 7 children. The second morning, 11, A reads the same books Elaine used to read. He found the list in a notebook she kept in the drawer of her bedside table, next to a church bulletin from March 13th, 2023, the last one she had been well enough to attend. He reads from the list in order. He is on the 43rd book. The photograph lives on the mantel now in a proper frame, the way it probably should have been displayed for years. But Raymond keeps the original, slightly creased, thick paper, the kind that doesn't bend easily, in the inside pocket of his brown suit jacket, which he still wears when he has somewhere important to be. He brought her here once. He brings her everywhere. That is the whole thing. Just like Steve said, not the clip, not the foundation, not the 800 people saying her name in an Atlanta conference room. The whole thing is a man who loved a woman for 52 years and found out that love doesn't stop when the other person does. It just changes address. It moves into the coat pocket, into the Thursday mornings at the library, into the way he still makes 2 cups of coffee sometimes before he remembers, and then drinks them both slowly. Because wasting one of them would feel wrong. Love doesn't end. It finds what it can carry. If this story is sitting with you the way it sat with that studio, subscribe and turn on the bell. There are people carrying photographs right now that the world has not yet asked to see. Share this for one of them.